Have you ever looked in the mirror and thought about how we got here? Most of us grew up hearing the exact same simple story. We started in caves, figured out how to make fire, invented the wheel, and eventually built skyscrapers and smartphones. We love to think of ourselves as the ultimate, final product of nature. But what if that story is missing a few massive chapters? What if we aren't the first advanced civilization to walk this planet, but just the newest update? What if we are actually humanity version 6.0? Think of planet Earth like a giant computer system. Every now and then, it experiences a massive crash. Maybe it's a sudden, freezing ice age, a catastrophic global flood, or a supervolcano blocking out the sun for years. The system wipes itself clean, hits the reset button, and reboots. We all know this happened to the dinosaurs, but we rarely stop to ask if it happened to us. Could there have been entirely different versions of humanity before our current one? Versions that built massive monuments, unlocked incredible technologies, and then completely vanished without a trace? When we look at ancient myths from all over the world, from the Native Americans to the ancient Greeks, they all talk about previous worlds that were destroyed to make way for ours. Are these just fairy tales invented around a campfire, or are they the faint surviving memories of humanity 1.0, 2.0, or 5.0? And more importantly, if the system was reset before, who or what is controlling the reboot? Today we are going to explore the forgotten blueprints of our past. We won't use complicated scientific jargon or boring academic terms. We are just going to look at the clues left behind and ask the biggest question of all. Are we the sixth version of humanity? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. The visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. If you take a globe right now, close your eyes, spin it, and stop it with your finger, chances are you will land on a place that has a very specific, very strange story to tell. Mainstream historians and scholars usually brush these stories off. They call them myths, legends, or campfire tales invented by primitive people who were just terrified of the dark and didn't understand how thunderstorms worked. They tell us that ancient humans made up stories about the end of the world because they were scared of nature. But when you actually start listening to these ancient voices, a completely different picture begins to form. We aren't just looking at random stories of boogeymen and monsters. We are looking at a highly organized, strangely consistent global memory. Cultures that were separated by massive oceans, impenetrable mountain ranges, and thousands of years of time. People who supposedly never met, never traded, and never spoke the same language are all telling the exact same story. And that story is a warning. It is the story of the Earth hitting the reset button over and over again. It is the story of multiple versions of humanity rising to greatness, only to be wiped out when the system crashes. Let's start in the deserts of North America, with the Hopi people. The Hopi are one of the oldest Native American tribes, and their oral traditions are not just spiritual teachings, they are survival records. According to the Hopi, the world we are walking on right now is not the original Earth, not even close. They believe we are currently living in the fourth world. So, what happened to the first three? The Hopis say that the first world was perfectly balanced, but humans became greedy and fought with one another, forgetting their place in the universe. So, the Creator destroyed it with fire. Think about that for a second. a global destruction by fire. Was this a massive solar flare, a period of intense volcanic activity? Whatever it was, the system was wiped clean. Then came the Second World. Again, humanity multiplied, advanced, and then fell out of balance. This time, the world was destroyed by ice. It was frozen solid. In modern terms, we would just call that a catastrophic ice age. Then came the Third World. In this version, humanity became incredibly advanced. The Hopi legends explicitly mention that the people of the Third World created high-tech travel, including flying machines they called patu vota, which they used to attack cities far away. This sounds suspiciously like advanced aircraft and modern warfare, doesn't it? Because of this corruption and destructive technology, the Third World was destroyed by a massive global flood. Water swallowed everything. But here is the most fascinating part of the Hopi legend. They say that during each of these planetary reboots, a select group of good people were saved by going deep underground. They were guided and protected by mysterious beings known as the Ant People. Mainstream scholars say the Ant People are just a metaphor for insects. But if you look at it through the lens of a lost, advanced civilization, you have to ask, who were these Ant People? Were they a breakaway group of highly advanced humans living in deep underground bunkers, wearing helmets with antennas that made them look like ants to the primitive survivors on the surface? Or were they something not of this earth entirely? Regardless of who they were, they helped the survivors emerge into our current reality, the Fourth World. Now let's leave the deserts of America and travel thousands of miles across the globe to ancient India. In Hinduism, the concept of time isn't a straight line from past to future, like we are taught in school. Instead, time is a massive, endlessly turning wheel. And this wheel is divided into 4 distinct ages, or yugas. What makes the Hindu yugas so fascinating is that they describe a process of technological and spiritual downgrade. It is exactly like a battery slowly running out of power. The cycle begins with the Satya Yuga, the Golden Age. In this first version of humanity, people lived for incredibly long periods. They were deeply connected to the universe, highly intelligent, and didn't need to struggle for survival. They had access to knowledge and abilities that we would consider pure magic today. In ancient Indian texts, there are detailed descriptions of vimanas, which were flying palaces or chariots that could travel into space and across the world, armed with weapons that sound terrifyingly similar to modern nuclear missiles. Were these the technologies of humanity version 1.0? As the wheel of time turns, the battery drains. We move into the Treta Yuga, then the Dvapara Yuga. With each new age, human lifespan drops. Our intelligence shrinks. Our connection to the truth fades, and the world becomes more physical, more difficult, and more corrupt. The advanced technologies of the past are lost, misunderstood, and eventually turned into myths. Finally, the cycle reaches the bottom, the Kali Yuga. This is the age of darkness, ignorance, conflict, and total disconnection. And guess what? According to Hindu tradition, the Kali Yuga is the age we are living in right now. We are the exhausted battery. We are the final, lowest version of the cycle, waiting for the massive reset that will wipe the slate clean and start the Golden Age all over again. If we travel from India to the shores of the Mediterranean, the ancient Greeks had almost the exact same concept, even though they used different words. The famous Greek poet Hesiod, writing nearly 3,000 years ago, described the 5 ages of man. He didn't use the idea of a wheel, he used the concept of degrading metals. He started with the Golden Age. Just like the Hindu Satya Yuga, the Greek Golden Age was a time of perfection. Humans and gods lived together. But who were these gods? Were they actual magical beings living on Mount Olympus, or is it possible that primitive humans were trying to describe a highly advanced race of beings, perhaps the survivors of a previous Earth reset, or visitors from somewhere else, who shared the planet with them? The people of the Golden Age didn't have to work, and they never grew old, but that version of humanity ended, replaced by the Silver Age. The Silver Age humans were less advanced, foolish, and constantly fought with each other. The gods, tired of their behavior, wiped them out. Next came the Bronze Age. These people were tough, aggressive, and obsessed with war and building weapons. They eventually destroyed themselves in endless, brutal conflicts. Then came the Age of Heroes, a brief spark of greatness where the men of the Trojan War lived before they too faded away. Finally, Hesiod describes the Iron Age. He wrote, "Men never rest from labor and sorrow by day, and from perishing by night." He was talking about us. The Iron Age is the current version of humanity. It is the hardest, coldest, and most disconnected age. Just like the Hopi and the Hindus, the ancient Greeks believed that our current version of humanity is not the peak of evolution. We are not the smartest, the strongest, or the best. We are simply the leftovers. We are the rusted iron at the very end of a long, glorious timeline that has been repeatedly wiped out. If we cross the Atlantic Ocean and head down into the dense jungles of Mexico, we find the mighty Aztec Empire. You would think that an empire built in the middle of Central America would have a completely different origin story than the Greeks or the Hindus. But once again, we find the exact same blueprint. The Aztecs believed that the universe had been created and destroyed 4 times before our current era. They called these cycles the 5 suns, and they were incredibly specific about how each of the previous versions of humanity was annihilated. The first sun was inhabited by a race of giants. This is a detail that pops up everywhere, from the Bible's Nephilim to the giant skeletons rumored to be hidden in the basements of the Smithsonian. The Aztecs say these giants were eventually wiped out by jaguars and the world went dark. The second sun was populated by humans who were destroyed by massive, supernatural hurricanes. The winds were so strong that they blew away entire cities and forests. The third sun was wiped out by a rain of fire from the sky. Think about the physical reality of that. A rain of fire. Was it a massive meteor shower? A comet fragment hitting the ice caps? The Aztecs said the ashes darkened the sky for years. The fourth sun was destroyed by a colossal flood. The water covered the highest mountains and all of humanity drowned, except for a very small handful of survivors who managed to escape in a boat. Does that sound familiar? It is the exact same flood story found in the Bible in ancient Mesopotamia and in the Hopi traditions. Today we are living under the 5th sun, and the Aztecs left us a very chilling prophecy. They stated that the 5th sun, our version of humanity, is destined to be destroyed by earthquakes. The ground will shake, the earth will open up, and the stars will fall. When you lay all these stories out side by side on a table, the similarities are impossible to ignore. Hopi, Hindu, Greek, Aztec, fire, ice, water, wind, golden ages degrading into iron ages, advanced flying machines, giants, and survivors fleeing underground. Mainstream science tells us to treat these as separate, isolated fairy tales. They want us to believe it is just a coincidence that human beings on opposite sides of the planet hallucinated the exact same history. But what if they didn't hallucinate it? What if these aren't myths at all? What if they are shattered fragments of a true global history? When a computer crashes and reboots, sometimes you can find old files from the previous operating system hidden deep inside the hard drive. These myths are the hidden files of our ancestors. They are the panicked, fragmented memories of people who watched the sky fall, who watched the oceans rise, and who realized that they were just the latest version in a long line of human prototypes. They left us these stories to tell us one simple truth. The reset button has been pushed before, and there is absolutely no reason to believe it won't be pushed again. But myths are just words passed down through the wind. What happens when we stop looking at stories and start looking at the actual bones, blood, and DNA buried in the dirt? Because if the Earth really did host previous versions of humanity, the proof wouldn't just be in the legends, it would be written in our biology. Let's start digging up the family tree. So far, we have looked at the software of human history. We have explored the myths, the legends, and the ancient stories that talk about previous worlds being wiped out by fire, ice, and floods. But stories are just echoes in the wind. Mainstream science demands physical proof. If there were previous versions of humanity, where are their bones? Where is the biological hardware that proves we are just the latest update in a long, complicated development cycle? To find out, we have to close the history books, grab a shovel, and dig deep into the dirt. We are going back in time, stripping away the smartphones, the cities, and the clothes to look at the raw, biological family tree of humanity. And when you look at the fossil record not as a slow, boring, random accident of nature, but as a series of distinct product launches, a series of versions, the story of human evolution suddenly looks a lot less like a natural progression and a lot more like a laboratory experiment. Let's start at the very beginning of the human timeline. Let's look at the absolute first prototype. Welcome to Humanity version 1.0. Australopithecus. Picture the African landscape around 4 million years ago. The climate is shifting. The massive, dense rainforests that covered the continent are starting to dry up and shrink. They are being replaced by vast, open, golden savannas. For millions of years, our ancient ape-like ancestors lived comfortably in the trees. They had long arms for swinging from branch to branch and feet that could grab onto bark like a second pair of hands. The trees were safe. The trees had fruit. But then out of nowhere, something radical happens. A new model appears on the scene. The most famous fossil of this version is a skeleton scientist named Lucy. If you were to see Lucy today, you probably wouldn't invite her to dinner. She was only about 3.5 feet tall, covered entirely in thick hair, and had a brain roughly the size of a large orange. From the neck up, she looked exactly like a chimpanzee, but from the neck down, version 1.0 featured a massive, world-changing hardware update. Lucy walked on 2 legs. In the scientific community, this is called bipedalism, and it is the single most important leap in human history. But if you stop and really think about it, walking on 2 legs is a terrible idea for an ape. When you stand up straight on the African savanna, you instantly become a walking billboard for every hungry lion, leopard, and saber-toothed cat in a 5-mile radius. You lose the ability to sprint on all fours. You lose the ability to quickly scramble up a tree to escape danger. Biomechanically, your lower back takes on a massive amount of stress, and giving birth becomes incredibly painful and dangerous because the pelvis has to change shape. It was a highly risky, dangerous physical downgrade in terms of immediate survival. So why did it happen? Mainstream anthropologists will tell you that they stood up so they could see over the tall savanna grass to spot predators or to carry food back to their families. But is that really enough to fundamentally rewrite the biological code of a species? Alternative thinkers and researchers who look at the margins of history ask a different question. Was this a natural, random mutation, or was this the first deliberate modification? Because standing up on 2 legs did one magical thing: it freed the hands. Version 1.0 was incredibly vulnerable, buggy, and primitive. They didn't have claws, they didn't have sharp fangs, and they couldn't run fast. But by freeing their hands, the system laid the foundation for everything that would come next. You cannot build a spaceship, you cannot paint a masterpiece, and you cannot swipe on a smartphone if you are using your hands to walk. Version 1.0 was the rough draft. It was the proof of concept that a 2-legged primate could survive. But having free hands is useless if you don't have the brain power to figure out what to do with them. For over 1 million years, version 1.0 basically just wandered around eating roots and trying not to get eaten by giant cats. The timeline was completely stagnant. And then, roughly 2.4 million years ago, the Earth experienced a sudden, massive system update. The biological hardware was dramatically upgraded. Enter humanity version 2.0, Homo habilis. The name Homo habilis translates to handyman, and this version represents the very first technological revolution on planet Earth. For millions of years, the world was just a collection of animals reacting to their environment. But version 2.0 did something no other creature had ever done. They looked at the physical world and realized they could alter it. They picked up rocks, visualized what they wanted to create, and smashed them together at the exact right angle to create a sharp edge. To us today, a broken rock looks like garbage. To version 2.0, that sharp rock was the iPhone 1. It was a revolutionary piece of technology. It was a knife, a scraper, and a weapon all rolled into one. With this simple stone tool, the entire trajectory of the planet changed. Version 2.0 didn't have the teeth to tear through the thick hide of a dead elephant or rhino. But with a sharp rock, they could slice through the skin. More importantly, they could smash open the massive bones of scavenged animals to get to the marrow inside. Bone marrow is pure, calorie-dense, highly nutritious fat. It is the ultimate brain food. And suddenly, thanks to this sudden shift in diet, the brains of version 2.0 began to rapidly expand. Their brain capacity was almost double that of version 1.0. But this is where the timeline gets a little weird, and where the conspiracy theories start to creep in. The leap from a simple, ape-like creature wandering the savannah to a creature with a suddenly expanded brain that understands the complex geometry of crafting stone tools is a massive jump. It didn't happen smoothly. In the fossil record, it appears almost abruptly. This sudden, unexplained leap in intelligence has fueled theories that have circulated in the darkest corners of the internet and the bravest circles of alternative history for decades. If you look at the ancient Sumerian clay tablets, some of the oldest written records on Earth, they tell the story of the Anunnaki. According to these ancient texts, the Anunnaki were beings who came from the heavens to Earth. They needed gold, but they didn't want to mine it themselves. So the story goes they took the primitive hominids that were already living on Earth, perhaps our version 1.0, and genetically altered their DNA, splicing it with their own, to create a smarter, capable worker race. Mainstream science laughs at this idea, calling it pure science fiction. They insist that the sudden brain expansion of Homo habilis was just a lucky roll of the evolutionary dice. But when you look at how drastically and suddenly version 2.0 upgraded the game, it makes you wonder, did Handyman figure out how to crack rocks completely on his own? Or was a new line of code quietly inserted into his DNA by an outside programmer? Was version 2.0 the first artificially enhanced human? Whether you believe in ancient genetic manipulation or just really lucky evolution, the fact remains that version 2.0 set the stage for the most successful, most dominant version of humanity that has ever existed. A model so incredibly robust, so adaptable, and so tough that it survived on this planet longer than any other human species before or since. Around 2 million years ago, the system pushed out humanity version 3.0, Homo erectus, the upright man. If human evolution is a massive video game, Homo erectus holds the absolute, undisputed high score. Think about this to put things into perspective. You and I, modern humans, have only been walking this planet for roughly 300,000 years. Homo erectus survived for almost 2 million years. They were the ultimate survival machines. Version 3.0 looked drastically different from the previous models. They lost the thick, ape-like body hair. They grew much taller, some reaching over 6 feet tall, with long, athletic legs designed for endless running. Their brains were significantly larger, approaching the size of our own. They were no longer the prey. They became the apex predators. And version 3.0 had a severe case of wanderlust. They were the first version of humanity to pack their bags and leave the continent of Africa. They walked out of the savannas, crossed the burning deserts of the Middle East, trekked through the freezing mountains of Asia, and reached all the way to the jungles of Indonesia and the plains of China. They conquered the globe, but their greatest achievement, the thing that truly separates them from every other animal on Earth, is that version 3.0 captured magic. They tamed the ultimate monster, fire. Before Homo erectus, fire was a terrifying, uncontrollable force of destruction caused by lightning strikes or volcanoes. Every living creature fled from it in absolute panic. But version 3.0 stopped running. They turned around, approached the flames, and figured out how to keep it alive. They eventually learned how to spark it themselves. Taming fire was not just about staying warm in the winter. It was a biological and social revolution. Fire was the ultimate external stomach. By cooking their meat and root vegetables, version 3.0 broke down the tough fibers and toxins before the food even hit their mouths. This meant their bodies didn't have to waste massive amounts of energy running a huge, heavy digestive system. The intestines shrank, and all that saved energy was redirected straight to the top of the head. Cooking food literally fueled the explosive growth of the human brain. But fire did something else, something deeper. It created the very concept of home. Before fire, when the sun went down, The world belonged to the monsters. Humans had to hide in the dark, absolutely silent, praying they wouldn't be eaten. But with fire, the darkness was pushed back. The day was extended. They could sit in a circle of light, look at each other's faces and communicate. The campfire is where primitive grunts started to turn into language. It is where sharing information, planning the next day's hunt, and perhaps even the very first storytelling began. The campfire was the original internet, a central hub where data was shared. Homo erectus had fire. They had excellent stone tools, crafting beautiful, symmetrical hand axes that they carried with them everywhere, like prehistoric Swiss army knives. They successfully migrated across the entire planet. They adapted to freezing winters and blazing summers. But here is the massive, lingering mystery of version 3.0. They had all the pieces of the puzzle. They had the brains, the tools, the fire, and the global reach. And yet, for nearly 2 million years, they just stopped. They hit a wall. The design of their stone hand axes barely changed over 1 million years. It is as if a tech company released an incredible piece of software and then refused to update it for 2 million years. Why didn't they take the next step? Why didn't they build villages, invent the wheel, or create written language? They had 2 million years to figure it out, 6 times longer than we have had. Or is it possible that they did when we look at the immense span of time that version 3.0 was on Earth? We are talking about millions of years. Deep time. Time that we cannot even begin to comprehend. If a highly advanced, localized civilization of Homo erectus did pop up somewhere in Asia or Africa 1 million years ago, built massive cities of stone and wood, and then was wiped out by a cataclysm, would we even know? After 1 million years of earthquakes, glaciers, floods, and shifting tectonic plates, every single trace of that civilization would be crushed into dust and swallowed by the earth. Mainstream science insists that Homo erectus never advanced past the campfire and the stone axe, but the conspiracy-minded researcher looks at that 2 million year gap and sees a massive, terrifying blank space. A blank space big enough to hide an entire fallen empire. Whatever happened, the reign of the ultimate survival machine eventually came to an end. Despite their incredible success, despite conquering the globe and taming fire, humanity version 3.0 was eventually phased out. The system was preparing for a new rollout. The environment was changing, getting colder, harsher, and more demanding. The old hardware just wasn't going to cut it anymore. To survive the coming ice ages, the Earth needed a version of humanity that wasn't just tough. It needed a version that was brutal, highly intelligent, and built like a tank. It was time for the heavy-duty models to take the stage. It was time for versions 4.0 and 5.0. As the global climate began to swing wildly, plunging the northern hemisphere into brutal, freezing ice ages, the Earth's operating system needed a hardware update. The tall, slender, running bodies of humanity version 3.0 were perfect for the African savanna, but they were a death sentence in the frozen wastelands of Ice Age Europe. The system needed something tougher. It needed a heavy-duty model built specifically to survive the cold, hunt massive prey, and endure unimaginable physical punishment. Enter humanity version 4.0, Homo neanderthalensis, better known as the Neanderthals. For over a century, mainstream science and popular culture have done the Neanderthals a massive injustice. If you say the word Neanderthal today, most people picture a hunched-over, hairy, grunting caveman dragging a club, completely devoid of intelligence. But the physical and archaeological evidence tells a completely different story. If you were to give a Neanderthal a shave, a haircut, and put him in a modern suit, and he walked onto a subway train in New York City, you probably wouldn't even look twice. Except you might notice how incredibly wide and powerfully built he was. Version 4.0 was the muscle car of the human family tree. They were shorter and much stockier than we are, with massive, barrel-shaped chests and incredibly thick bones. Their bodies were perfectly engineered by nature to retain heat. They had huge, wide noses designed to take in freezing Ice Age air and warm it up before it hit their lungs. They were apex predators, taking down woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos in close quarters combat using heavy thrusting spears. They didn't just survive the Ice Age, they conquered it. But here is the most shocking fact about humanity version 4.0. Their brains were actually larger than ours. That's right. The so-called dumb cavemen had a larger cranial capacity than modern humans. And they used that brain power. They weren't just brute beasts. They had a rich, complex culture. They made specialized tools. They used pitch to glue stone points to wooden shafts, and they created jewelry from eagle talons. They were the first version of humanity to wear tailored clothing, using bone needles to sew animal hides together to survive the freezing winters. More importantly, version 4.0 had a soul. They had empathy. In a cave in Iraq called Shanidar, archaeologists found the remains of a Neanderthal man who had been severely disabled. He was blind in one eye, his right arm was withered and amputated above the elbow, and he had severe arthritis. In the wild, an animal with these injuries dies immediately. But this man lived to be around 45 years old, an incredibly old age for that era. Why? Because his family took care of him. They chewed his food for him, protected him, and healed his wounds. And when Neanderthals died, they were carefully buried in the ground, sometimes with beautiful wildflowers placed carefully over their bodies. They understood death, they felt grief, and they possibly believed in an afterlife. Version 4.0 was incredibly successful, ruling Europe and parts of Asia for roughly 300,000 years. But while the heavy-duty Neanderthals were dominating the frozen West, an entirely different, heavily shrouded mystery was unfolding in the Deep East. This is where the human family tree gets genuinely spooky. Welcome to Humanity version 5.0, the Denisovans. If the Neanderthals are the famous muscle cars of history, the Denisovans are the ghosts. We know almost nothing about what they looked like, how they lived, or how they died. In fact, for a long time, science had absolutely no idea they even existed. They weren't discovered by digging up a massive, complete skeleton. They were discovered in 2010 inside a freezing cave in Siberia when scientists found a single, tiny fragment of a pinky finger bone and a couple of oversized teeth. When scientists extracted the DNA from that tiny pinky bone, the results sent shockwaves through the entire biological world. The DNA didn't match modern humans, and it didn't match Neanderthals. It was an entirely new, undocumented version of humanity. It was like finding a secret, hidden file deeply embedded in the Earth's hard drive. Because we only have a few teeth and bone fragments, we have to guess their physical appearance. But the teeth that were found are massive, much larger than ours or the Neanderthals. This has sparked intense speculation, especially in alternative history circles. Remember the Aztec myths of the first sun being populated by a race of giants? Remember the biblical stories of the Nephilim? Could the Denisovans have been a race of massive, towering humans who roamed the Asian steppes? We don't know for sure, but the massive size of their teeth certainly leaves the door wide open for that possibility. But the Denisovans left behind something even more mysterious than oversized teeth. In the same Siberian cave layer where Denisovan remains were found, archaeologists discovered a piece of jewelry that should not exist. It is a stunningly beautiful bracelet made of green chlorite stone. But it's not just a carved rock. The bracelet features a perfectly drilled hole. When modern experts examined this hole, they were baffled. The precision of the drilling indicates that whoever made it used a high-speed rotational drill. The speed of the drill would have to be incredibly fast, with minimal vibration, to prevent the delicate stone from shattering. Mainstream history tells us that high-speed drilling technology wasn't invented until tens of thousands of years later. So how did a supposed caveman 40,000 years ago manufacture a piece of jewelry that requires modern mechanical engineering? Was version 5.0 in possession of lost, advanced technology? Were they the remnants of a highly advanced civilization that was wiped out by one of the Earth's violent resets? The Denisovan bracelet remains a glaring, out-of-place artifact, a glitch in the historical timeline that mainstream science struggles to explain. Even though the Denisovans vanished into the shadows of deep time, they didn't leave empty-handed. They left a piece of their code behind. Today, modern humans living in the highest altitudes of Tibet carry a specific Denisovan gene in their DNA. This genetic code allows their blood to process oxygen in incredibly thin, freezing mountain air without suffering from altitude sickness. The ghosts of version 5.0 are still breathing through the lungs of people today. Now pause for a moment and picture the Earth around 50,000 to 70,000 years ago. It wasn't the lonely planet we know today. It was a real-life version of the Lord of the Rings. You had different human species sharing the globe at the exact same time. You had the heavy-duty Neanderthals in Europe, the mysterious, possibly giant Denisovans in Asia, perhaps a few surviving pockets of Homo erectus in the remote jungles, and a bizarre, tiny species nicknamed hobbits, Homo floresiensis, living on an island in Indonesia. The planet was crowded with different versions of humanity, and then a new player entered the game. The final update. Humanity version 6.0, Homo sapiens, us. Physically, we were arguably the weakest version on the board. We didn't have the thick bones or the massive muscles of the Neanderthals. We didn't have the heavy fur or the cold weather adaptations. We were naked, frail, and incredibly vulnerable. If a Neanderthal and a Homo sapiens got into a wrestling match, version 6.0 would be crushed in seconds. Yet today, we are the only ones left. The Neanderthals are gone. The Denisovans are gone. The hobbits are gone. We took over the entire planet, split the atom, walked on the moon, and connected the globe with an invisible web of information. How did the physically weakest version win the survival game so decisively? The answer lies in a sudden, dramatic, and highly controversial software upgrade known as the cognitive revolution. Around 70,000 years ago, something inside the brain of version 6.0 just clicked. It was an explosive leap in intelligence that defies standard evolutionary logic. For millions of years, the progress of tool-making was agonizingly slow. A rock was a rock for a million years. But suddenly Homo sapiens started innovating at a blinding speed. We invented bows and arrows, sewing needles, fish hooks, and oil lamps. We started painting breathtaking, complex, three-dimensional art on the walls of caves in France and Indonesia. We carved flutes out of bone and played music. But the ultimate weapon of version 6.0 wasn't a sharper spear. It was imagination. Earlier versions of humanity could communicate. A Neanderthal could probably point to a river and make a sound that meant, "There is a lion by the river, let's run." But version 6.0 developed a complex, incredibly nuanced language that allowed us to talk about things that did not physically exist. We could look at the dark woods and say, "There is a river spirit that protects our tribe, and if we offer it food, it will give us strength to fight the lion." This ability to invent fictions, to believe in myths, gods, nations, and eventually money is what gave us supreme power. You can only get about 150 people to cooperate based on knowing each other personally. But if you invent a story about a powerful sun god, or a story about a unified nation, you can get millions of strangers to cooperate, build giant temples, and form massive armies. Imagination allowed version 6.0 to organize in numbers that the Neanderthals simply couldn't comprehend. But this sudden explosion of art, complex language, and imagination is a massive puzzle. Why did it happen so fast? In the timeline of the Earth, 70,000 years is literally a blink of an eye. Evolution is supposed to be a slow, blind, random process of tiny mutations over millions of years. It doesn't usually produce overnight miracles. This inexplicable jump has led to some of the most profound and controversial theories regarding human origin. Was this sudden spark of genius just a lucky genetic mutation, as mainstream biologists claim, or was it something else? Some researchers point to the stoned ape theory, suggesting that our ancestors consumed naturally occurring psychedelic mushrooms, which hyperconnected their neural pathways and rapidly expanded their consciousness, literally forcing the brain to invent language to describe the bizarre hallucinations. But other, more fringe theories point back to the sky. They look at the sudden, unexplained leap from primitive hunter-gatherers to builders of civilization and ask if the code of version 6.0 was deliberately rewritten. If you go back to the ancient Sumerian texts, the story of the Anunnaki states that they didn't just create humanity once, they continuously upgraded their workers. Is it possible that the cognitive revolution was an artificial software patch? Did a highly advanced civilization, whether from the stars or the survivors of a previous Earth reset, decide to intervene? Did they unlock our junk DNA, activating the dormant genes required for advanced mathematics, astronomy, and complex language? We may never know the exact catalyst, but the results are undeniable. Armed with this new, terrifying cognitive power, version 6.0 swept across the globe like a tidal wave. Wherever we went, the other versions of humanity quietly vanished. Did we hunt them down and exterminate them in the first massive global war? Did we outcompete them for food? Or did we simply breed them out of existence, absorbing their useful DNA into our own genetic code? The truth is probably a dark mix of all three. We were the ultimate invasive species. We didn't just survive, we conquered, assimilated, and destroyed anything that stood in our way. We became the undisputed masters of the planet. But as we sit here today, staring at our glowing screens, completely confident in our absolute supremacy, We have to remember the history of the system. We are just the sixth version, and just like the versions before us, our time on this Earth is completely dependent on the stability of the hardware. And as the ancient myths warned us, and as the geological record proves, the Earth is not a stable machine. Every few thousand years, the screen goes blue, the ice comes, the fire falls, the water rises, the system crashes. So what exactly are these catastrophic resets? What triggers them? And more importantly, how close did humanity version 6.0 come to being completely wiped off the face of the Earth before we even had a chance to build our first city? We walk outside, look up at the blue sky, feel the solid concrete under our feet, and assume that the world is a safe, stable place. We build our houses right on the edge of the ocean. We construct massive skyscrapers on top of fault lines, and we plan our futures decades in advance. We have this deep, comforting illusion that the Earth is a gentle mother, a perfectly balanced terrarium designed specifically to nurture humanity version 6.0. But if you ask a geologist, they will tell you a completely different story. The Earth is not a safe, stable spaceship. It is an incredibly violent, unpredictable machine. And throughout its history, this machine has repeatedly experienced catastrophic system failures. When the pressure builds up too high, or when an outside force smashes into the system, the Earth doesn't just quietly adjust, it violently reboots. It hits the giant reset button. And when that happens, whatever version of humanity happens to be walking the surface gets caught in the crossfire. To understand how a highly advanced civilization could be completely erased from the map, we don't need to look for alien laser beams or magical spells. We just need to look at the Earth's natural reset buttons. Let's look at the actual scientifically proven cataclysms that have brought our ancestors to the absolute brink of extinction. The most common recurring reset button on this planet is the Ice Age. When we hear the word Ice Age, thanks to cartoon movies, we usually just picture a fun, snowy winter wonderland with woolly mammoths and saber-toothed squirrels. But a true glacial period is a completely different nightmare. Imagine stepping outside your front door in New York City, London, or Chicago and looking up. But instead of seeing clouds or skyscrapers, you are staring at a solid wall of blue ice that is 2 miles high. That is not an exaggeration. During the peak of the last ice age, massive continental ice sheets, thousands of feet thick, covered the entire northern hemisphere. These ice sheets were unimaginably heavy. They weren't just sitting there, they were moving. They acted like continental-sized bulldozers, slowly grinding across the land, crushing mountains, carving out deep valleys, and literally scraping the top layer of the Earth's crust completely off. Think about the implications of that. If there was a previous version of humanity, say a highly advanced pocket of Homo erectus or a lost Denisovan civilization that had built cities of stone, monuments, or roads anywhere in the northern half of the globe, the ice would have destroyed it. A 2-mile-high glacier doesn't just knock a building over. It grinds the stones into fine powder and pushes them hundreds of miles away into the ocean. The Ice Age is the ultimate eraser. It wipes the hard drive of the planet completely clean, leaving absolutely no trace that anyone was ever there. But slow-moving ice is not the only way the Earth hits reset. Sometimes the destruction is instantaneous. Sometimes the threat comes from deep underground. Let's rewind the clock to roughly 74,000 years ago. Humanity version 6.0, our direct Homo sapiens ancestors, had just started to figure things out. They were developing complex language, making better tools, and starting to organize. The population was slowly growing, things were looking up. And then on the island of Sumatra in modern-day Indonesia, the ground ripped open. This was the Mount Toba supervolcano eruption. To understand the sheer scale of this event, we have to forget everything we know about normal volcanoes. When Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, it blew the top off a mountain and darkened the sky for hundreds of miles. It was a massive disaster. But the Toba eruption was approximately 3,000 times more powerful than Mount St. Helens. It was one of the largest explosions in the entire history of the planet. When Toba blew, it didn't just destroy an island. It blew a hole in the earth so massive that it altered the global climate instantly. The explosion blasted roughly 700 cubic miles of rock, ash, and toxic gas straight up into the stratosphere. To visualize that, imagine burying the entire city of Los Angeles under a mile of solid rock and then instantly vaporizing it. That massive cloud of ash and sulfur dioxide didn't just stay in Indonesia. High-altitude winds caught the toxic cloud and wrapped it completely around the globe like a suffocating blanket. The sun vanished. The blue sky turned into a dark, toxic, bloody twilight. And because the sun's rays could no longer reach the surface, the temperature of the Earth plummeted overnight. This caused what scientists call a volcanic winter. For several agonizing years, it simply did not stop snowing in places that were supposed to be tropical jungles. The plants, deprived of sunlight, withered and died. The massive herds of grazing animals starved to death, and right behind them, the human predators who relied on those animals began to starve too. The Toba eruption was a massive, violent system crash, and the biological data shows us just how close we came to being permanently deleted. Geneticists have mapped the DNA of modern humans from all over the world. Whether you are from a remote village in Africa, a bustling metropolis in Asia, or a quiet farm in Europe, your DNA is incredibly, almost suspiciously, similar to the person sitting next to you. In fact, if you take two wild chimpanzees living in the exact same jungle, they will have more genetic variation between them than any two human beings on opposite sides of the planet. Why is our genetic code so incredibly narrow? Because of a phenomenon known as a genetic bottleneck. When scientists trace our genetic mutations back in time, they see a terrifying mathematical reality. Roughly 70,000 years ago, right around the exact same time, the Toba supervolcano exploded. The human family tree was violently chopped down. The global population of humanity version 6.0 did not gradually decline. It fell off a cliff. According to the most startling genetic estimates, the worldwide population of human beings plummeted to perhaps as few as 2,000 to 10,000 individuals. Think about that number for a second. 10,000 people. You can fit 10,000 people into a minor league baseball stadium. Out of the entire massive planet, that was all that was left of us. A few scattered, starving, freezing bands of hunters huddling around campfires in the endless dark, desperately trying to keep the flames alive. We were an incredibly endangered species. We were a failed prototype that was just a few bad winters away from total extinction. If those few thousand people had died, humanity version 6.0 would have ended right there. The Earth would have rebooted, perhaps allowing the Neanderthals to take over, or perhaps wiping the board clean of advanced primates entirely. We survived the Toba reset by the absolute skin of our teeth, but the Earth wasn't done testing us. Let's fast forward to a much more recent point in our history. Let's travel to around 12,800 years ago. At this point on the timeline, things were finally starting to look great for our ancestors. The brutal, long-lasting ice age that had frozen the world for tens of thousands of years was finally ending. The giant glaciers were melting and retreating back toward the poles. The weather was warming up, the green forests were returning, and humans were thriving. They were hunting, exploring, and, according to many alternative researchers, they might have been settling down, building the very first advanced societies and mapping the stars. And then, in the blink of an eye, the world ended again. This period is known to geologists as the Younger Dryas. It is one of the most baffling, mysterious, and terrifying climate events in the history of the Earth. Right in the middle of a beautiful global warming trend, the temperature of the planet suddenly plummeted back into deep ice age conditions. And when we say suddenly, we don't mean over thousands of years. Ice core samples pulled from Greenland show that the global climate shifted radically in the span of perhaps a single decade. It was like walking out of a warm summer house in a t-shirt and instantly stepping into an Arctic blizzard. For decades, mainstream science had no idea what caused the Younger Dryas. It defied all known climate models. What could possibly cause a warming planet to instantly freeze over? In recent years, a highly controversial but incredibly compelling theory has emerged. It is called the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. And if it is true, it perfectly explains the terrifying myths of our ancestors. The theory suggests that 12,800 years ago, a massive comet entered our solar system. As it swung around the sun, the intense heat caused the comet to fracture into multiple glowing pieces. The Earth, in its orbit, flew directly into the path of this cosmic shotgun blast. But why isn't there a massive dinosaur killer crater on the Earth? Because, according to the hypothesis, the comet fragments didn't hit solid rock. They hit the 2-mile thick ice sheet that was still covering North America and parts of Europe. Imagine thousands of nuclear bombs detonating simultaneously on top of a massive glacier. The heat of the impact would have instantly vaporized millions of tons of solid ice, sending a colossal cloud of boiling steam, ash, and debris straight into the atmosphere, once again blocking out the sun and triggering the sudden, violent freezing of the Younger Dryas. The physical evidence for this catastrophic impact is scattered all over the globe, hidden right beneath our feet. Geologists have discovered a distinct, dark layer of soil dating exactly to 12,800 years ago. They call it the black mat. This black mat layer is filled with microscopic diamonds, melted glass, and iridium, materials that are only created under the extreme heat and pressure of a cosmic impact. More terrifyingly, the black mat is essentially a layer of burned earth. It suggests that immediately following the impact, massive, continent-wide wildfires swept across the globe. Remember the Hopi legend of the First World being destroyed by fire? Remember the Aztec story of a rain of fire from the sky? If the comet impact theory is true, these aren't just fairy tales. These are the eyewitness testimonies of the people who watched the sky burn. But the fire and the deep freeze were only the first half of the nightmare. The Younger Dryas period lasted for roughly 1,200 brutal freezing years, and then it ended just as suddenly as it began. The Earth warmed up rapidly, But all that ice that had been destroyed, cracked and melted by the comet impacts had to go somewhere. It went into the oceans. This triggered a catastrophic series of events known as meltwater pulses. Trillions of gallons of freezing water, which had been trapped in massive glacial lakes in North America, suddenly broke through their ice dams. This water rushed across the land with unimaginable violence, scouring the earth down to the bedrock and emptying into the oceans. The result was a sudden, terrifying and globally devastating rise in sea levels. Within a very short period of time, the global ocean levels rose by nearly 400 feet. To put a 400-foot sea level rise into perspective, think about our modern civilization today. Where are all our biggest cities located? New York, London, Tokyo, Miami, Mumbai, Sydney. They are all built on the coastlines. Human beings have always built their most advanced settlements near the water, where trade, fishing, and agriculture are the easiest. If the oceans rose by 400 feet tomorrow, 80% of our modern civilization would be instantly swallowed by the sea. Now apply that logic to the people living 12,800 years ago. If there was a thriving, advanced Humanity 6.0 civilization, perhaps the legendary civilization of Atlantis, or an ancient maritime empire that mapped the globe, they wouldn't have built their cities high up in the freezing mountains. They would have built them on the lush, fertile coastlines. When the meltwater pulses hit, those coastlines were completely obliterated. The water didn't just rise slowly like a filling bathtub. It came in massive, continent-crushing tsunamis. It swallowed islands, it erased coastal plains, and it drowned everything in its path. Suddenly, the ancient myths stop sounding like magical metaphors and start sounding like accurate historical reports. The Hopi Third World destroyed by water, the Aztec fourth son swallowed by the flood, the biblical story of Noah, the epic of Gilgamesh. They are all talking about the exact same event. They are talking about the end of the Younger Dryas. They are talking about the massive global reset that drowned the world 12,000 years ago. Science gives us the cold, hard data. It gives us the ice cores, the genetic bottlenecks, the volcanic ash, and the microscopic diamonds. It proves, without a shadow of a doubt, that the Earth has repeatedly pushed the reset button, nearly wiping humanity out of existence. But science only answers the how. It doesn't answer the why. Because when we look at the incredible timing of these disasters, when we look at how perfectly they line up with the sudden leaps in human evolution, a darker, more unsettling question begins to rise to the surface. Were these catastrophic events truly just the random, blind cruelty of nature, just a streak of terrible luck in the cosmic casino? Or is it possible that the system wasn't crashing by accident? What if the reset button wasn't pushed by a random comet or a blind volcano? What if somebody or something was deliberately trying to wipe the slate clean, just like a programmer deleting an old buggy version of software to make room for the new one? Let's dive into the forbidden histories and the suppressed theories of intentional destruction. When your computer gets infected with a virus, starts lagging, or becomes so overloaded with corrupted files that it simply cannot function properly anymore, what do? You don't try to fix every single broken line of code. That would take forever. Instead, you save the most important files on a backup drive, completely wipe the hard drive clean, and reinstall the operating system from scratch. You hit Control-Alt-Delete. You initiate a deliberate, intentional reset. Mainstream science tells us that the massive cataclysms of the past, The sudden ice ages, the supervolcanoes, the catastrophic meteor impacts were just random acts of a chaotic universe. They tell us that humanity just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was just incredibly bad luck that a comet smashed into the North American ice sheet 12,800 years ago, nearly wiping us off the map. But as we peel back the layers of ancient history and start reading the oldest text ever written by human hands, a very dark, very unsettling alternative theory begins to emerge. What if it wasn't an accident? What if the massive floods and fires weren't just the Earth acting up, but a deliberate protocol being executed? What if humanity version 6.0, or perhaps an incredibly advanced version 5.5 that came right before us, grew too powerful, too corrupt, or too dangerous, and the system administrators decided it was time to pull the plug? To explore this terrifying possibility, we have to look at the single, most widespread, deeply ingrained memory in the human psyche: the Great Flood. If you travel to any corner of the globe and ask the indigenous people about their deepest history, you will hear a story about water. We already talked about the Hopi and the Aztecs, but it doesn't stop there. In the biblical book of Genesis, God sees that humanity has become wicked and violent, so he opens the heavens and floods the entire earth, saving only Noah and his family. In ancient Greek mythology, the god Zeus becomes disgusted by human cannibalism and arrogance, so he unleashes a massive deluge, saving only Deucalion and his wife. In ancient Hindu texts, the god Vishnu warns a man named Manu about an impending global flood and tells him to build a massive boat to save the seeds of life. From the frozen tundras of Siberia to the deep jungles of the Amazon, from the islands of Polynesia to the mountains of Tibet, there are over 500 distinct flood myths recorded across human cultures. Mainstream historians will tell you that primitive people lived near rivers, rivers sometimes flood, and primitive people exaggerate. Therefore, a local river flooding became a myth about the whole world drowning. But does that really make sense to cultures separated by massive oceans who never spoke to each other, all independently invent the exact same highly specific story about a global wipeout, a chosen survivor, a giant boat, and a divine warning? Or are we looking at the traumatized, collective memory of a species that literally watched the oceans swallow their entire civilization? If we want the unvarnished truth, we have to go back to the absolute oldest written records on Earth. We have to go back to ancient Sumeria in modern-day Iraq. Thousands of years before the Bible was written, the Sumerians carved their history into clay tablets using a language called cuneiform, and what they wrote completely shatters the idea of a random natural disaster. The Sumerian texts, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis epic, describe a time when the earth was ruled by beings called the Anunnaki. We mentioned them briefly before. According to the texts, these gods lived alongside humans, and they were the ones who engineered us to do their heavy lifting. But over time, the human population exploded. We became too numerous, too loud, and too difficult to control. The texts are chillingly specific. The chief administrator of these gods, a figure named Enlil, basically decides that the human experiment has become a nuisance. We are like a weed that has overgrown the garden. We are a software program consuming too much RAM. So Enlil calls a council and makes a cold, calculated decision. Wipe them all out. Delete the entire human race using a massive global flood. He forces all the other gods to swear an oath of silence so that the humans will have absolutely no warning. Does this sound like a random act of nature to you? Or does it sound like a board of directors deciding to terminate a failed project? But there is a twist. Another one of these beings, named Enki, who was considered the chief scientist and the one who actually helped engineer humanity in the first place, feels a sense of responsibility for his creation. He cannot break his oath of silence to directly warn the humans, so he uses a loophole. He speaks to the wall of a reed hut where a human named Utnapishtim is sleeping, indirectly warning him that a catastrophic wave is coming. Enki gives him exact mathematical blueprints to build a massive, submersible boat to survive the impending apocalypse. When you read the Sumerian account, the flood is not described as just rain falling from the sky. It is described as a terrifying high-tech weapon. The texts talk about pillars of blackness touching the sky, the land being completely shattered like a pot, and a roaring noise that terrified even the gods themselves, who fled into the higher heavens to escape the destruction. This sounds less like a thunderstorm and a lot more like a massive, targeted atmospheric weapon, or the intentional melting of the ice caps to trigger a rapid sea level rise. If this flood was intentional, if the gods or the system administrators really did hit the reset button, who exactly were they trying to wipe out? Were they just annoyed by primitive cavemen making too much noise around the campfire? That doesn't make any sense. You don't flood the entire planet to kill a few cavemen. You flood the planet to destroy an empire. You hit the reset button when a civilization becomes a massive, unstoppable threat. This brings us to the most famous, most debated, and most tantalizing lost civilization in human history, Atlantis. When people hear the word Atlantis, they usually roll their eyes and think of comic books, cartoon mermaids, or ridiculous sci-fi movies. But the original story of Atlantis wasn't a fairy tale. It was recorded by Plato, one of the most brilliant and respected philosophers in ancient Greece. Plato didn't just invent the story, he explicitly stated that the history of Atlantis was passed down to the Greeks from high-ranking Egyptian priests who kept records of deep antiquity in their temples. According to Plato, Atlantis was not just a magical island, it was a massive, highly advanced, global maritime empire that existed thousands of years before the Greeks or the Egyptians. The Atlanteans were master architects, brilliant engineers, and unparalleled navigators. They built a magnificent capital city composed of concentric rings of water and land, featuring colossal harbors, massive bridges, and complex canals. Some alternative researchers believe that Atlantis represented the absolute peak of humanity version 5.5, or an early, forgotten peak of version 6.0. In the conspiracy world, it is highly speculated that the Atlanteans possessed technologies that we are only just beginning to understand today. They didn't necessarily have smartphones or gasoline cars. Their technology might have been completely different. Legends suggest they harnessed the energy of the Earth's electromagnetic grid, using massive, perfectly cut crystals to generate unlimited, wireless power. They mastered the frequencies of sound to levitate heavy stones, explaining how colossal ancient monuments were built all over the world. They mapped the entire globe from the skies. They were practically gods. But just like a computer system that runs perfectly for years before developing a fatal glitch, the Atlantean civilization became corrupted. Plato wrote that as the Atlanteans grew more powerful, their divine nature began to fade. They became completely consumed by greed, arrogance, and a lust for absolute power. They began launching brutal military campaigns to conquer the rest of the known world, enslaving other nations and abusing their incredible technology. In modern terms, they became a global superpower that went rogue, threatening to destroy the entire balance of the planet. And then the system crashed. Plato described the end of Atlantis with terrifying precision. He wrote that, in a single day and night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis was swallowed by the sea, accompanied by massive earthquakes and floods. It was completely erased from the face of the earth. Now let's connect the dots. Plato stated that the destruction of Atlantis happened exactly 9,000 years before his time. If you do the math, that places the sinking of Atlantis right around 11,600 years ago. Does that date sound familiar? It absolutely should, because 11,600 years ago is the exact, precise geological moment that the Younger Dryas period violently ended. It is the exact moment when the massive meltwater pulses rushed into the oceans, rapidly raising global sea levels by hundreds of feet. The ice core data completely backs up Plato's timeline. Science confirms that a massive global flood happened exactly when the Egyptians said Atlantis sank. Is this just an unbelievable coincidence, or is Plato's story a literal historical account of a rogue, high-tech human civilization being intentionally neutralized by a global cataclysm? If the Atlanteans had pushed their advanced technology too far, perhaps messing with genetic engineering or developing weapons that could crack the Earth's crust, did the gods, the Anunnaki, or the planet itself decide that humanity version 5.5 was a failed experiment that needed to be terminated? If the Great Flood was an intentional targeted attack designed to wipe the hard drive clean, it completely changes how we look at human survival. Because if you know a massive world-ending cataclysm is coming, you don't just stand on the beach and watch the waves roll in. You prepare. You build backups. This brings us to one of the most mysterious, mind-boggling archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. A discovery that proves ancient humans were terrified of the sky and went to unimaginable lengths to survive an apocalypse. In the region of Cappadocia, in modern-day Turkey, a man was renovating his basement in 1963. He knocked down a wall, and behind it he found a dark tunnel. When archaeologists started exploring that tunnel, they didn't just find a small cave. They found a massive, sprawling, multi-level underground metropolis known as Derinkuyu. Derinkuyu is not just a few holes dug in the dirt. It is a highly engineered 18-story deep subterranean city carved directly into solid volcanic rock. It extends over 280 feet deep into the earth. It is massive enough to comfortably house and protect 20,000 people, along with their livestock, their food supplies, and their water. Whoever built Derinkuyu possessed advanced knowledge of geology and engineering. The city features miles of complex ventilation shafts that bring fresh air all the way down to the 18th level, ensuring that tens of thousands of people wouldn't suffocate. It features deep wells for fresh drinking water. It has dedicated rooms for kitchens, schools, oil presses, and even stables for horses and sheep. But the most terrifying feature of Derinkuyu is its security system. On every level, the passageways can be completely sealed off by massive circular stone doors, some weighing up to 1,000 pounds. But here is the massive red flag. These stone doors can only be rolled closed and locked from the inside. You don't build a 1,000-pound stone door that only locks from the inside to protect against a random thunderstorm. And you definitely don't dig an 18-story underground city capable of holding 20,000 people just for fun. Derinkuyu is a massive, incredibly elaborate bomb shelter. It is a prehistoric doomsday bunker. Mainstream historians try to explain Derinkuyu by saying it was built by early Christians hiding from Roman armies. But while it's true that later cultures used the caves, the original builders remain completely unknown. The sheer scale and the incredible effort required to carve out millions of tons of solid rock point to a society that was highly organized, technologically capable, and absolutely terrified of something happening on the surface. Look at modern tech billionaires today. They are buying massive tracts of land in New Zealand and building multi-million-dollar underground bunkers equipped with air filtration systems and years of food supplies. Why? Because they have access to data, they see the geopolitical instability, and they know that a massive global disruption is possible. They are preparing for a system crash. Did the leaders of humanity version 5.5 do the exact same thing? Were places like Derinkuyu the ancient equivalents of billionaire doomsday bunkers? If a select group of elites, the Atlanteans or the chosen humans, warned by Enki in the Sumerian myths, knew that the Great Flood or a rain of fire from a comet was coming, they would have done exactly what the Hopi legends describe. They would have taken their most important people, their seeds and their knowledge, and they would have gone deep underground with the ant people to wait out the apocalypse. When the waters finally receded, when the fires burned out and the skies finally cleared, these survivors would have crawled out of their bunkers into a completely shattered, empty world. They were the backup files. The entire infrastructure of their advanced civilization, their coastal cities, their massive ports, their electrical grids, was completely obliterated, crushed into dust by the ice and swallowed by the mud. They were suddenly highly advanced people, stranded in the Stone Age. And what would you do if you were a brilliant Atlantean engineer or a scientist who just survived the end of the world? You would try to rebuild. You would travel around the globe, finding the scattered, primitive hunter-gatherers who managed to survive in the high mountains, and you would try to teach them the lost arts. You would teach them agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and stone masonry. To the primitive, traumatized survivors of the disaster, these advanced refugees coming out of the underground bunkers or arriving on surviving ships wouldn't look like regular men. They would look like magical beings. They would look like gods who fell from the sky, bringing the gifts of civilization. Is this why, almost overnight, seemingly out of nowhere, primitive humans suddenly started building massive, impossibly precise stone monuments that align perfectly with the stars? Is this why we find pieces of technology in the dirt that simply should not exist? We have explored the software of the myths and the terrifying hardware of the geological resets. Now it is time to look at the glitches in the matrix. It is time to look at the physical fingerprints left behind by these survivors, the impossible architecture and the out-of-place artifacts that mainstream science is desperately trying to hide. Imagine walking into a prestigious museum, wandering past the dinosaur skeletons, and looking into a glass display case. Inside the case, resting right next to a giant T-Rex skull, is a perfectly preserved, fully functional iPhone. Your brain would immediately reject what you are seeing. It is impossible. You know for an absolute fact that whoever was alive 65 million years ago did not have the microchips, the lithium batteries, or the manufacturing plants required to build a smartphone. It completely breaks the timeline. It is an anomaly. In the world of alternative history and archaeology, these impossible objects are called out-of-place artifacts, or OOP arts. They are the glitches in the matrix. They are the physical fingerprints left at the crime scene that completely contradict the official police report. Mainstream history presents human progress as a straight, incredibly boring, uphill line. We are told that our ancestors started as primitive, grunting cavemen. Over tens of thousands of years, they slowly figured out how to domesticate wild wheat, which allowed them to settle down in one place. Once they settled down, they had free time to invent the wheel, make pottery, and figure out how to stack stones to build simple walls. Eventually, thousands of years later, they built cities, temples, and pyramids. That is the official timeline: agriculture first, architecture second. But what happens when you dig a hole in the dirt and find a massive, incredibly complex, perfectly engineered skyscraper that was built thousands of years before the invention of the hammer? You don't just rewrite the history book, you have to throw the entire book into the fire. And that is exactly what happened in the mid-1990s in the dusty rolling hills of southeastern Turkey at a site called Göbekli Tepe. If you want absolute, undeniable physical proof that humanity version 6.0 is suffering from collective amnesia, Göbekli Tepe is the smoking gun. For decades, the locals just thought it was a hill covered in broken rocks, but when a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt started digging, he didn't find the remains of a primitive campsite. He uncovered a massive, sprawling complex of circular stone temples. These weren't just simple stacks of rocks, they were colossal, meticulously carved, T-shaped limestone pillars. Some of these pillars are over 16 feet tall and weigh up to 20 tons. They were arranged in perfect, massive circles, connected by precisely built stone walls. But the pillars aren't just blank blocks of stone, they are completely covered in breathtaking, high-relief, three-dimensional carvings of animals. There are lions, scorpions, boars, foxes, and massive vultures. The artwork is so detailed and so perfectly proportioned that it looks like it was done by a master sculptor in the Renaissance, not a primitive caveman living in the dirt. But here is where the timeline completely shatters. When scientists tested the organic material found around the pillars using radiocarbon dating, the results came back with a number that caused absolute panic in the archaeological community. The central pillars of Göbekli Tepe were erected roughly 11,600 years ago. Stop and let that number sink in. 11,600 years ago. According to the mainstream timeline, 11,600 years ago, human beings were completely primitive hunter-gatherers. They were wearing animal skins and chasing herds of deer with sticks. They had not invented agriculture. They had not invented the wheel. They did not have metal tools. They didn't even have pottery to hold water. Building Göbekli Tepe would have required hundreds, if not thousands, of highly organized workers. It would require quarrying 20-ton blocks of solid limestone from a hillside, moving them hundreds of yards without wheels or draft animals, standing them perfectly upright, and carving them with razor-sharp precision using nothing but other, slightly harder rocks. To feed a workforce that massive, you need organized agriculture, you need farms. But farms didn't exist yet. Göbekli Tepe is the equivalent of finding a group of people who don't know how to make a paper airplane, but somehow they managed to build a fully functioning Boeing 747. It is a total paradox. But if you connect this to the catastrophic timeline we talked about earlier, the mystery of Göbekli Tepe suddenly makes terrifying sense. Remember the date the Earth's climate suddenly warmed, melting the massive glaciers and causing catastrophic global flooding. The end of the Younger Dryas period. And exactly when did that happen? Around 11,600 years ago. Remember the date the Greek philosopher Plato gave for the sudden catastrophic destruction of the advanced empire of Atlantis? Exactly 11,600 years ago, and now the oldest, most impossibly advanced stone temple on Earth, popping up completely out of nowhere with zero evolutionary background, dates to the exact same millennia. Alternative researchers look at Göbekli Tepe and see a very clear, desperate message. They don't see a temple built by primitive hunter-gatherers who suddenly had a lucky stroke of genius. They see a survival bunker. They see an ark made of stone. They see the frantic, immediate work of the brilliant survivors of the Great Flood, the refugees of humanity version 5.5, trying to pass down their advanced knowledge to the primitive people who survived the cataclysm. The animal carvings on the pillars might not just be decorations. Some astronomers and ancient sky watchers believe that Göbekli Tepe is a massive, complex astronomical observatory. The animal figures on the T-shaped pillars perfectly match the constellations in the night sky 12,000 years ago. The vulture represents Cygnus, the scorpion represents Scorpius. The entire complex is a giant clock made of stone, tracking the movement of the stars. More importantly, it seems to track the meteor shower that many believe caused the catastrophic Younger Dryas impacts. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were pointing at the sky, leaving a permanent warning in solid rock. Watch the stars, the fire comes from above, the reset is real. But the most bizarre, absolute craziest fact about Göbekli Tepe isn't how it was built, it is how it ended. Roughly 1,000 years after it was constructed, the builders did something completely incomprehensible. They didn't just abandon the temple, they didn't get conquered by an invading army who destroyed it. Instead, they deliberately, painstakingly buried the entire massive complex. They hauled thousands of tons of dirt, rocks and debris and completely filled in the massive stone circles until the entire temple was swallowed by a giant artificial hill. They hid it. Why in the world would an ancient culture spend decades building the most magnificent structure on Earth, only to spend just as much time intentionally burying it in the dirt? Mainstream science has absolutely no logical answer for this. They mumble something about changing religious beliefs or decommissioning a sacred space. But if you look at it through the lens of a traumatized civilization that has just barely survived a global reset, burying the complex is the smartest thing they could possibly do. They knew the Earth was unstable. They knew another massive flood, another ice age, or another meteor impact could wipe them out again. If you leave a 16-foot limestone pillar standing out in the open, it will be eroded by wind, cracked by freezing ice, or knocked over by an earthquake over the next 10,000 years. But if you bury it deep underground in a sealed artificial mountain of dirt, you protect it from the elements. You preserve the data. Göbekli Tepe wasn't just a temple, it was a massive, ancient time capsule deliberately sealed by its creators, waiting patiently in the dark for thousands of years until humanity version 6.0 was finally advanced enough to dig it up and read the warning. Göbekli Tepe completely shatters the illusion that our ancestors were primitive, but unfortunately it is not an isolated glitch. Once you start looking for these impossible architectural anomalies, you find them everywhere. And the further back in time you go, the more massive, precise, and unexplainable the construction gets. Let's talk about the absolute nightmare of ancient logistics, moving massive, impossibly heavy rocks. When you watch a documentary on the History Channel, they always show you a neat little animation of how ancient people moved heavy stones. They show hundreds of happy, shirtless workers pulling on thick hemp ropes, rolling a big block of stone over a series of wooden logs. It makes sense on a television screen, but when you step out of the animation and look at the actual physics of the real world, the ropes and logs theory completely falls apart. Let's travel from Turkey to the ancient ruins of Baalbek in modern-day Lebanon. At the base of the Roman temple of Jupiter, there are 3 colossal blocks of stone known as the trilithon. These aren't just big rocks, they are some of the largest building blocks ever used by human beings. Each one of these massive, perfectly rectangular stones weighs approximately 800 tons. And sitting in a nearby quarry, there is an even larger stone, known as the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, which is estimated to weigh over 1,000 tons. To help you visualize that, a standard American car weighs about 2 tons. So moving one of these stones is the exact equivalent of stacking 400 cars on top of each other and trying to pull them across the dirt. If you ask modern engineers how they would move a 1,000-ton block of solid rock today, they will tell you that it is an absolute logistical nightmare. You would need specially designed, massive hydraulic cranes, steel tracks, and diesel-powered flatbed transporters that have hundreds of tires just to distribute the incredible weight so it doesn't instantly sink into the earth. Yet, mainstream historians tell us that people thousands of years ago, using nothing but wooden sticks, copper chisels, and ropes made from twisted plant fibers, managed to cut these 800-ton blocks perfectly out of the bedrock, drag them for miles across uneven terrain, and then lift them more than 20 feet into the air to perfectly place them into a retaining wall. It is physically impossible. If you put 10,000 men on a rope to pull an 800-ton stone, the sheer tension and the combined pulling force would instantly snap any natural fiber rope ever created. Furthermore, if you put a stone that heavy on top of rolling wooden logs, the crushing weight of the rock would instantly pulverize the wood into sawdust and push it deep into the mud. You cannot drag a skyscraper with a piece of string, but the mystery doesn't stop at the sheer weight. The precision of the ancient builders is even more terrifying than the size of the stones. If we cross the ocean to the high Andes mountains of Peru, we find the megalithic fortress of Sacsayhuaman. Located high above the city of Cusco, this site features massive zigzagging walls made of colossal stones, some weighing over 100 tons. But these stones are not perfectly square blocks like bricks. They are chaotic, multi-sided shapes known as polygonal masonry. Some stones have up to 12 different angles, and yet, despite being massive, strangely shaped rocks, they fit together with a precision that defies modern engineering. The ancient builders did not use a single drop of mortar, cement, or glue to hold these walls together. They simply locked the stones into each other. The cuts are so impossibly exact and the joints are so incredibly tight that even today, after thousands of years of massive earthquakes shifting the ground, you cannot slide a single sheet of standard copy paper between the massive stones. Try to comprehend the level of technology required to do that. If you are carving a 100-ton rock with a copper chisel and you make a mistake by a single millimeter on one corner, the rock is ruined. It won't fit tightly against its neighbor. You can't just pick up a 100-ton rock, check the fit, put it back down, shave off a little more dust, and lift it again. You have to get the multi-angled, three-dimensional geometric cut absolutely perfect on the very first try, while the stone is still sitting on the ground. Today, to achieve that level of precision, we use computer-guided, diamond-tipped, water-cooled industrial laser saws. The ancient Peruvians supposedly did it by banging rocks against other rocks. The orthodox explanations are insulting to our intelligence. The experts are desperately trying to force the evidence to fit their neat, straight-line timeline of human evolution. They refuse to admit that they have absolutely no idea how these structures were built. But if we accept the possibility that we are humanity version 6.0 and that we are walking on the graveyard of a far more advanced version 5.5, the impossible stones suddenly stop being a mystery. They become the surviving infrastructure of a lost age. What if the builders of Baalbek and Sacsayhuaman didn't use ropes and logs at all? What if they understood the deep, hidden physics of the Earth that we are only just beginning to grasp today? There are fringe theories circulating among brilliant, unorthodox engineers that suggest the ancients used the power of sound, acoustic levitation. We know today, in modern laboratories, that you can use highly focused sound waves and harmonic frequencies to levitate small objects like droplets of water or tiny beads in midair. What if a previous civilization scaled that technology up? What if they understood the exact resonant frequency of solid granite and limestone using massive, tuning fork-like instruments to literally cancel out the gravitational pull of the Earth, making an 800-ton stone light enough to push with one hand? It sounds like pure science fiction, but is it really any crazier than believing primitive cavemen pulled 400 cars worth of solid rock with twisted grass ropes without snapping them? Everywhere we look, from the buried observatory of Göbekli Tepe to the impossible walls of Peru and the colossal blocks of Lebanon, we see the undeniable fingerprints of a high-tech global civilization. But here is the most explosive part of this architectural mystery. These structures aren't just similar, they are identical. How did cultures on opposite sides of the planet, separated by thousands of miles of deep oceans, build using the exact same impossible techniques? They didn't just share a style of architecture, they shared a blueprint. And this leads us to the most massive, most suppressed conspiracy of the ancient world, the phantom empire that the history books are terrified to mention. If you travel to New York City, Tokyo, London, and Dubai, and you see a restaurant with golden arches selling hamburgers, you instantly understand what you are looking at. You don't assume that 4 different groups of people, completely isolated from each other, accidentally invented the exact same logo, the exact same menu, and the exact same building design. You know that it is a global franchise. There is a central headquarters, a master blueprint, and a shared system of operation. Now take that exact same logic and apply it to the ancient world. When you look at the massive pyramids of Egypt and then travel across the Atlantic Ocean to find massive step pyramids hidden in the jungles of Mexico and Guatemala, the mainstream historians tell you it is just a coincidence. They call it parallel development. They claim that human beings in different parts of the world just naturally decided to stack millions of heavy rocks in the exact same shape, perfectly aligned to the exact same stars in the night sky. But it isn't just pyramids. It is the techniques. It is the polygonal puzzle piece masonry in Peru that perfectly matches the ancient walls found in Japan, Italy, and Egypt. It is the use of metal clamps shaped like an hourglass or a bow tie, poured with molten metal to hold massive stone blocks together. We find these identical metal clamps in the ruins of Pumapunku in Bolivia, at the Parthenon in Greece, and in ancient temples in Cambodia. You do not accidentally invent the exact same highly complex architectural engineering as someone on the other side of the planet. These identical techniques are the golden arches of antiquity. They are the undeniable physical proof of a global franchise, a master blueprint, a single, highly advanced civilization that either spanned the entire globe or traveled the globe, teaching their techniques to the scattered, primitive survivors of humanity, version 6.0. But what if this global empire isn't just buried in the dust of 12,000 years ago? What if a version of this unified, highly advanced global civilization existed much, much more recently? What if they were here just a few hundred years ago, and their existence was deliberately deleted from our modern history books to keep us under control? Welcome to the ultimate architectural conspiracy, the lost empire of Tartaria. If you spend enough time digging into the strange, unexplained corners of the internet, you will eventually stumble across old, highly detailed maps from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. On these maps, stretching across the massive expanse of northern Asia, from the Ural Mountains all the way to the Pacific Ocean, is a colossal country labeled Tartaria, or Grand Tartaria. It is drawn larger than China, larger than Russia. Mainstream historians will quickly dismiss this. They say Tartaria was just a vague catch-all term that ignorant European mapmakers used to describe the vast unknown lands of Asia, populated by wandering nomads and scattered tribes. They tell us it wasn't a real empire, it was just a placeholder on a map. But the conspiracy theorists, the alternative researchers, and the people who actually look closely at old photographs suggest a terrifyingly different reality. They suggest that Tartaria was not a myth. It was a massive, highly advanced, peaceful, global empire that possessed technology far superior to our own. And they didn't just live in Asia. Their influence covered the entire world. The physical proof of the Tartarian Empire, according to the theory, is hiding right in plain sight. It is in the architecture. Look at the incredibly grand, impossibly detailed Greco-Roman and neoclassical buildings found in almost every major city on Earth. You can find these massive, domed structures with towering columns, intricate archways, and heavy stone facades in Washington, D.C., in Paris, in Moscow, in Buenos Aires, in Cape Town, and in Melbourne. We are told that early settlers arriving in horse-drawn wooden wagons wearing heavy wool coats somehow managed to build these colossal, perfect stone monuments in the mud, often in just a year or two, using primitive cranes and hand tools. The Tartarian theory asks a very simple, very dangerous question. What if they didn't build them? What if they just found them? What if the history of the 19th century is a massive cover-up? The theory proposes that the world was recently hit by a localized reset known as the mud flood. According to this idea, some catastrophic event, perhaps a geological weapon, a massive shift in the Earth's crust, or a deliberate attack by the current ruling elite, caused massive amounts of mud and dirt to sweep through the streets of the world's major cities, burying the ground level of these magnificent Tartarian buildings. If you walk down the street in many old cities today and look at the ground-level windows of historical buildings, you will see that they are cut off. The first floor of the building is literally underground. Mainstream architects say this was done for ventilation or basement light, but looking at it through the lens of a massive cover-up, it looks exactly like the street level was artificially raised by several feet of compacted mud, burying the original entrances of a lost civilization. But the Tartarian Empire wasn't just known for beautiful buildings. They were known for power, free, unlimited wireless power. Look at the domes, the spires, the towering copper antennas, and the intricate metalwork on the tops of these old buildings. Mainstream history tells us these are just decorative elements. But what if they were functional? What if these buildings were actually giant machines designed to harvest atmospheric energy directly from the ether? What if the Tartarians had unlocked the secrets of electromagnetism, using water, copper, and sacred geometry to provide free heating, lighting, and power to the entire world? If you are a group of elite bankers and industrialists in the 1800s, and you want to completely control the global population, you cannot do it if everyone has access to free, unlimited energy. You have to destroy the Tartarian grid. You have to bury their buildings in the mud, rewrite the history books, steal their empty cities, and then introduce a new, dirty system that you can put a meter on. Coal, oil, and the modern electrical grid. You create artificial scarcity. You turn the free, magical world of Tartaria into the exhausted, stressful, Iron Age world of humanity version 6.0. Whether Tartaria was a literal global empire that fell in the 1800s, or just a fascinating internet mystery, it points to a profound human intuition. We look at the magnificent, impossible structures of the past, and we know in our gut that the official story is a lie. We know that someone at some point had the master blueprint. And this brings us to the most chilling question of all. If the ancient Egyptians, the builders of Göbekli Tepe, the architects of Peru, and perhaps even the lost Tartarians, all shared the exact same master blueprint for civilization, who originally drew the blueprint? Who was the architect? To find the architect, we have to travel back to the very dawn of written history. We have to look for the teachers. And once again, the physical evidence leaves us staring at an impossible global anomaly. Let's call it the mystery of the handbag. If you go to a museum and look at the ancient stone carvings from Sumeria, the first recognized civilization in the world, you will see depictions of their gods, the Anunnaki. These beings are often carved with wings, wearing strange, advanced-looking helmets, and holding something very specific in their hands. They are holding what looks exactly like a modern handbag or a small bucket. Now, a Sumerian god holding a little bucket is weird, but it's not a conspiracy. It only becomes a mind-bending conspiracy when you travel 7,000 miles away to the jungles of Mesoamerica. If you look at the massive stone statues of the Olmecs, the oldest civilization in the Americas, you will find the deity Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who supposedly brought knowledge to humanity. And what is he holding in his hand? The exact same small bucket, the exact same handbag. Let's go further back in time. Let's travel back to the impossible buried temple of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built exactly 11,600 years ago, right after the Earth's violent reset. On the famous Pillar 43, carved into the stone high above the animals, are three distinct, perfectly shaped symbols. They are three handbags. How does a symbol from 12,000-year-old Turkey perfectly match the symbols of ancient Iraq and ancient Mexico, thousands of years apart? separated by massive oceans. This is the smoking gun of the global franchise. This is the fingerprint of the teachers. But what exactly is in the bag? Mainstream historians will tell you it is just a basket for carrying water or seeds. But if you have just survived a global cataclysm, if the ice has melted and the sky has fallen, and you are trying to restart humanity version 6.0, what are the most important things you need to carry? Alternative researchers suggest that the handbag is not a basket at all. It is a symbol of technological and biological power. Was it a high-tech power source? Was it a massive digital hard drive containing the backups of the destroyed world, the blueprints for mathematics, agriculture, astronomy, and architecture? Or was it something even more profound? Was it a container for genetic material, the literal seeds of life used to reboot the biological ecosystem of the planet after the Great Flood wiped it completely clean? The Anunnaki, the gods of Sumeria, weren't the only ones carrying strange equipment. In almost every depiction of these ancient teachers, the handbag is accompanied by another bizarre object. They are almost always holding a small, perfectly carved pine cone. You will find the pine cone symbol everywhere. It is in the hands of the Sumerian gods. It is carved into the staffs of the Egyptian god Osiris. It is even sitting right in the middle of the Vatican today, where a massive, ancient bronze sculpture of a pine cone dominates the courtyard of the pine cone. Why a pine cone? In ancient, esoteric traditions, the pine cone is the ultimate symbol of the pineal gland, a small pine cone-shaped gland right in the absolute center of the human brain. Ancient cultures believed the pineal gland was the third eye, the seat of the soul, the biological antenna that allowed human beings to connect to higher dimensions, telepathy, and cosmic awareness. When you put the pieces together, the image of the Anunnaki teachers holding the handbag and the pine cone sends a very clear, very specific message. They weren't just bringing rocks and water to primitive cavemen. They were bringing the hardware, the technology in the bag, and they were upgrading the software, activating the pineal gland, the consciousness of humanity 6.0. They were the system administrators. When the Earth hit the reset button 12,000 years ago, wiping out the advanced civilization of version 5. These teachers, whether they were extraterrestrial beings like the Anunnaki or just the brilliant surviving human scientists of Atlantis, emerged from their underground bunkers. They sailed the world in surviving ships, finding the scattered, traumatized hunter-gatherers, and they handed them the blueprint. They taught them how to cut impossible stones. They taught them how to track the stars, to predict the next cataclysm. They gave them the golden arches of civilization. And then, just like a software developer who finishes installing a program, they stepped back into the shadows. They became myths. They became legends. They became the ghosts haunting our history books. We, humanity version 6.0, have spent the last 10,000 years slowly waking up. We think we have invented everything ourselves. We think our smartphones and our airplanes are the absolute pinnacle of original human achievement. But what if we are just slowly, painfully rediscovering the exact same technologies that were wiped out in the last reset? What if we are just tracing over the faded lines of a blueprint that was handed to us by the survivors of a forgotten world? If our entire civilization is just a rebooted copy of something much older and much greater, it forces us to face a terrifying reality. The ancient teachers left us the buildings and they left us the myths. But they also left us a warning, because whatever destroyed them, whatever caused the massive global system crash that buried their cities under the ice and the mud, is still out there. The timer is still ticking. And as we dig up the bones of the past and look at the completely impossible artifacts left behind, we have to ask, where did all this evidence go? If the world is covered in the ruins of Tartaria, Atlantis, and the Anunnaki, why isn't it on the front page of every science textbook in schools today? To answer that, we have to look at the gatekeepers. We have to look at the deep time that naturally erases history and the powerful institutions that deliberately hide the rest of it in the dark. Whenever we talk about ancient, forgotten civilizations, high-tech prehistoric empires, or previous versions of humanity, the skeptics always fire back with one massive, seemingly unbeatable question. They cross their arms, lean back and say, okay, if there was a highly advanced humanity version 5.0 that flew around in anti-gravity ships and built massive global empires, where is all their stuff? Why don't we dig up their smartphones, their plastic bottles, or the rusted frames of their cars? If they were so great, where is the physical trash they left behind? It is a fair question, but it is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how this planet actually works. We look at a plastic bottle and think it lasts forever. We look at a massive steel bridge and think it is permanent. We completely underestimate the most destructive, silent, and unstoppable force in the universe. We fail to understand the terrifying concept of deep time. To grasp deep time, we have to do a little thought experiment. Imagine that tomorrow a mysterious virus or a sudden cosmic event instantly wipes humanity version 6.0 off the face of the Earth. Every single human being simply vanishes. What happens to our permanent, advanced civilization? Within the first week, without human maintenance, the power grids fail. The pumps keeping water out of the subway systems in places like New York and London stop working, and within days those massive underground networks are completely flooded. They become dark, toxic underwater caves. Fast forward just 100 years. Without temperature control and constant painting, the massive steel suspension bridges connecting our cities begin to aggressively rust. The cables snap. The bridges collapse into the rivers. The glass windows on our massive skyscrapers crack from the freeze and thaw cycles of the weather, falling to the streets below. Roots from weeds and trees shatter the concrete sidewalks and highways. Fast forward 1,000 years. By this point, almost every modern house built of wood, drywall and nails has completely dissolved back into the dirt, eaten by termites and rot. Our incredible cities are now just massive, dangerous concrete jungles covered in thick green vines. Now push the fast-forward button to 10,000 years. 10,000 years is absolutely nothing in the grand timeline of the Earth. But for our modern materials, it is a death sentence. By now, the steel frameworks inside our skyscrapers have completely rusted away, causing the concrete to crumble into dust. Almost all of our paper records, our books, our photographs, and our digital hard drives have disintegrated. The plastic has been broken down by UV radiation and microscopic bacteria. If a team of alien archaeologists landed on Earth just 10 or 20,000 years after we disappeared, they wouldn't see shiny cities. They would see weird, unnatural hills covered in forests. If they dug into those hills, they wouldn't find iPhones or sports cars. They would just find a very strange, compressed layer of red dust, the oxidized remains of our steel, and perhaps some strange chemical isotopes trapped in the rock. And that is just 10,000 years. Now imagine 100,000 years, imagine 1,000,000 years. This brings us to a mind-bending concept proposed by brilliant modern astrophysicists, known as the Silurian hypothesis. The scientists asked a very simple, terrifying question. If an industrial civilization existed on Earth tens of millions of years ago, would we even be able to find it? Let's say 60 million years ago, a highly intelligent species of reptilian bipeds evolved, built massive cities, drove vehicles, and used industrial factories. Then they were wiped out by the exact same asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. Could we find their factories today? The scientific answer is a hard, absolute no, because of deep time. Over tens of millions of years, the surface of the Earth literally recycles itself. Tectonic plates smash into each other, pushing the ground high up into the air to create new mountains, or dragging it deep down into the fiery mantle of the Earth to be melted back into magma. Entire continents are ground into dust by glaciers or swallowed by rising oceans. Deep time doesn't just hide evidence, it completely vaporizes it. So when we ask why we don't find the advanced technology of humanity, version 3.0 or version 5.5, we are asking the wrong question. Our modern technology is fragile. Microchips and plastics do not survive geological resets. The only things that survive the crushing weight of deep time are the things made of the absolute hardest materials on the planet. Solid granite, diorite, massive blocks of limestone. That is why the only fingerprints we have left of the previous versions are the impossible megalithic stones. They didn't build with massive rocks because they were primitive cavemen who didn't know how to make drywall. They built with massive rocks because they knew that solid stone was the only material capable of surviving the inevitable system crash. But what about the things that do survive? What about the biological remains, the weird, out-of-place artifacts, or the bones that somehow got trapped in perfect conditions and fossilized? If there were giant humans, or if there were highly advanced machines buried deep in the ice or the mud, surely a modern hiker, a coal miner, or an independent archaeologist would have stumbled across them by now, right? Well, according to a massive, sprawling network of alternative researchers, whistleblowers, and historical detectives, we have found the evidence. We have found the giant skeletons. We have found the impossible artifacts. The problem is, you are never allowed to see them, because the moment these anomalies are pulled out of the dirt, the gatekeepers step out of the shadows. Welcome to the great institutional cover-up. To understand why a museum or a massive scientific institution would actively hide history, you have to understand human psychology and the business of academia. Mainstream science and history are not just noble pursuits of truth. They are massive, multi-billion-dollar industries. The current narrative that humanity evolved in a straight, uninterrupted line from primitive apes to modern geniuses is the foundational pillar of thousands of university departments. It is the basis for countless PhDs, millions of dollars in research grants, and thousands of published textbooks. If an independent researcher suddenly digs up an artifact that definitively proves humanity version 6.0 was preceded by an advanced global empire of giants, or that humans and dinosaurs coexisted, or that ancient people had free wireless energy, it doesn't just rewrite a paragraph in a textbook, it completely destroys the entire academic hierarchy. It turns the most prestigious professors in the world into fools overnight. It ruins careers. It cuts off the money. Institutions do not like to be proven wrong. When a system is threatened with absolute collapse, it defends itself. It hides the evidence. The most famous target of this conspiracy theory is the Smithsonian Institution in the United States. Today, the Smithsonian is a beloved, prestigious museum complex. But if you dig through the archives of old American newspapers from the late 1800s and early 1900s, you will find a very strange, recurring pattern. As the United States expanded westward, farmers, coal miners, and railroad workers were constantly digging up the earth. And according to hundreds of documented published newspaper reports from that era, they kept finding something terrifying. They were digging up massive, ancient burial mounds, and inside these mounds were the skeletons of human beings who were 7, 8, even 10 feet tall. Some reports describe skulls with double rows of teeth. These weren't tabloids making up ghost stories. These were local, respectable newspapers reporting on physical discoveries witnessed by entire towns. So, where are the bones? In almost every single one of these old newspaper articles, the story ends the exact same way. The local sheriff or the town doctor would secure the giant skeleton, and then, a few days later, experts from the Smithsonian Institution would arrive on a train. They would carefully pack the massive bones into wooden crates, load them onto a rail car heading east to Washington, D.C., and promise to study them and put them on public display, and then total silence. The bones vanished into the dark, bottomless basements of the museum system, never to be seen by the public again. Alternative researchers claim that the Smithsonian acted as the official cleanup crew for the historical narrative. Under the direction of early, rigid academics who were desperately trying to prove the newly formed Darwinian theory of straight-line evolution, anything that contradicted the official story was confiscated and locked away. You can't have a neat, orderly evolutionary tree if there is a random branch of 10-foot-tall superhumans ruining the chart. So they simply deleted the files. They hid the hardware. And the Smithsonian is not the only institution accused of guarding the secrets of our past. Let's cross the ocean to the heart of Rome, to an institution far older and far more secretive, the Vatican. Beneath the streets of the Vatican City lies the Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archives. It contains roughly 53 miles of continuous shelving. The Catholic Church has been a dominant global superpower for nearly 2,000 years. During the darkest, most chaotic periods of human history, when ancient empires fell, when the Library of Alexandria burned, and when European explorers conquered the New World, the Church was there. Conspiracy theorists and ancient mystery hunters believe that the Vatican archives hold the true, uncensored history of humanity version 6.0 and possibly the versions before it. When the Spanish conquistadors brutally wiped out the Aztec and Maya empires in the Americas, they famously burned thousands of ancient, indigenous books. They destroyed the collective memory of an entire continent. But did they really burn all of them? Or did the highest-ranking priests recognize the incredible, dangerous value of that ancient knowledge? Did they quietly pack the most important texts, the ones detailing the cycles of the Earth's resets, the blueprints of the Anunnaki, the maps of the underground bunker systems, and the true dates of the Great Flood, and ship them back to the dark vaults in Rome? We are told the archives only contain boring administrative letters and financial records of old popes, But access is incredibly restricted. You cannot just walk in and browse the 53 miles of shelves. You have to be a highly vetted scholar. You have to ask for a specific document by its exact index name, and you are strictly monitored. It is a fortress of information. What is sitting in the dark on shelf number 14,000? Is it the complete, uncut blueprint of the Tartarian energy grid? Are there detailed maps drawn by the Atlanteans before the ice melted? The gatekeepers know that knowledge is absolute power. If you control the past, you completely control the future. If you convince humanity version 6.0 that we are just highly evolved apes who accidentally invented the internet, we remain docile. We keep paying our taxes, we keep buying their metered electricity, and we stay completely distracted by the glowing screens in our hands. But if we suddenly realize the truth, if we saw the giant skeletons, the advanced out-of-place artifacts, and the undeniable proof that human consciousness has the capacity for magic, levitation, and free energy, the illusion of control would shatter instantly. We would stop acting like exhausted cogs in a machine, and we would start acting like the rightful heirs to a cosmic legacy. The institutional cover-up isn't just about hiding old bones, it is about hiding our potential. But no matter how deep the museums bury the artifacts, and no matter how violently deep time erases the physical cities of the past, the truth cannot be completely deleted. The Earth is a massive, shifting entity. Every day, glaciers melt a little further, exposing frozen secrets. Every day, ground-penetrating radar peers deeper beneath the jungle canopy, revealing the impossible geometric shapes of buried megacities. The system is starting to leak. The hidden files of the previous versions are slowly coming to the surface, and as we piece together the shattered fragments of humanity 1.0 through 5.5, we have to look away from the dirt and turn our eyes toward the horizon. Because understanding the violent, cyclical resets of the past isn't just a fun exercise in alternative history. It is a matter of absolute survival. The clock is ticking. The Earth is preparing for its next inevitable transition. What happens to us when the system blue screens again? Are we doomed to be wiped out, leaving nothing but a thin layer of plastic and rust for the next cycle? Or will we be the very first version of humanity to successfully beat the game? Let's look at the future and the coming rollout of humanity version 7.0. So, where does this leave us today? We have dug through the ancient myths of fire and ice, traced the sudden, unexplained biological leaps of our ancestors, and stared at the impossible megalithic stones of fallen global empires. We have looked at the terrifying, undeniable reality of the Earth's geological reset button. For roughly 300,000 years, humanity version 6.0 has successfully played the game of survival. But the Earth is a ticking time bomb. The ice will inevitably return, a supervolcano will eventually erupt, or a comet will cross our path again. If we stay exactly as we are, trapped on this single, fragile planetary hard drive, we will eventually be wiped out, leaving nothing but a thin layer of microplastics and radioactive isotopes in the rock for the next cycle to find. But here is the massive, world-changing difference between us and the heavy-duty Neanderthals, the mysterious Denisovans, or perhaps even the highly advanced Atlanteans. We are the very first version of humanity that is fully aware of the reset cycle. We see it coming, and we are actively building the ultimate cheat code to survive it. Welcome to the dawn of humanity version 7.0. This next massive software update isn't going to take millions of years of slow, random biological evolution. It is happening right now at lightning speed, driven by our own hands. Look at the smartphone you are holding. You are already a primitive cyborg. Your phone is an external brain that holds your memories, your navigation, and your ability to communicate across the globe instantly. The next logical step is simply moving that hardware inside with brain-computer interfaces, artificial intelligence, and genetic editing. Version 7.0 will be a powerful hybrid of biology and machine. We will literally rewrite our own DNA to become immune to the Earth's harsh environment. But even a highly advanced cyborg cannot survive if the entire planet cracks open. To truly beat the game, version 7.0 has to do something no other earthly civilization has ever done. We have to back up our data on a completely different server. We are taking our first, highly publicized steps toward becoming a multi-planetary species. When humans finally establish permanent self-sustaining colonies on Mars, the physical transformation will be rapid and undeniable. The lower gravity of Mars will stretch our spines, making humans significantly taller. The different radiation levels and artificial environments will permanently alter our biology. Within just a few thousand years, the humans living on Mars will be physically incapable of surviving the crushing gravity of Earth. They will be a completely new, distinct branch of the human family tree, version 7.0. Whether we merge our consciousness with artificial intelligence or build glowing, domed cities on the red dirt of Mars, the great transition has already begun. We are no longer just the traumatized, freezing survivors of the last ice age. We are the active architects of the next era. We might be the sixth version of humanity to walk this planet, sitting on top of the buried, forgotten ruins of the giants who came before us. But if we keep pushing forward, if we keep our eyes on the stars and refuse to let the system crash, we will be the very first version to live forever. Thank you for joining me on this massive journey through deep time and forbidden history. I want to hear from you. Do you think we are just lucky, highly evolved apes, or are we the amnesiac survivors of a forgotten global empire? Drop your theories down in the comments, and if this video made you question the reality of our past, hit that subscribe button so you never miss another glitch in the Matrix. Stay curious, and I will see you in the next one.